I'm Odessa Thorne, 32 years old, and I turned a failing family inheritance into the city's most vital community kitchen. The steam from the industrial dishwashers was finally beginning to clear, leaving a lingering scent of roasted garlic and rosemary clinging to my hair. My back ached in that specific, satisfying way that only comes from feeding 300 people in a span of 4 hours. Outside, the world was ending, or at least that's what it sounded like. The wind was howling against the reinforced glass of Thorne's table, and the freezing rain had hardened into sleet that peppered the alleyway like buckshot. I tightened the belt of my apron and grabbed the last two heavy black trash bags. Julian, my husband, was already by the front register, tallying the meager donations we'd received that week. He looked up, his brow furrowed over his rimless glasses, checking his Rolex. "Leave it for the morning crew, Odessa," he called out, his voice smooth and detached. "It's freezing out there." "I can't leave food waste overnight, Julian," I replied, my voice hoarse from shouting orders over the din of the dinner rush. "You know it attracts rats." I pushed open the heavy steel back door and gasped as the cold air slapped me across the face. It was brutal, the kind of cold that sinks through your clothes and grips your bones in seconds. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the flickering yellow light of a single street lamp that buzzed ominously overhead. I heaved the bags into the dumpster, the metal clang echoing in the narrow space. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of discarded rags, perhaps a blanket someone had dropped. But then the rags shivered. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I squinted through the driving sleet. Tucked into the small, dry wedge of space between the dumpster and the brick wall was a figure. It was small, too small to be out here alone. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The figure jerked, shrinking further into the shadows. I took a step closer, ignoring the icy slush soaking into my sneakers. It was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His face was smeared with grime, his lips a terrifying shade of pale blue. He wasn't just cold, he was freezing to death. But what caught my attention wasn't just his size. It was what he was holding. His knuckles were white, gripping a rusted metal box against his chest with a ferocity that suggested it contained the crown jewels. "Odessa," Julian's voice cut through the wind. He stepped out into the alley, wrapped in his cashmere wool coat, looking entirely out of place among the garbage and the grime. "What are you doing? Get inside." "Look," I whispered, pointing at the boy. Julian followed my gaze. His expression didn't soften, it hardened. He took a step back, instinctively shielding himself from the reality of the streets. "A stray," Julian muttered, his tone clinical. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "I'll call the police. Social services can pick him up. They have protocols for this." The boy's head snapped up at the word police. That was the moment everything changed. Under the grime and the matted hair, I saw his eyes. They were amber, striking, unusual, and burning with a terrifying mixture of fear and defiance. I felt a phantom ache in my chest. I wasn't looking at a stranger. I was looking at a mirror. I saw myself at 12 years old, hiding in the pantry while my father screamed about money, clutching my mother's locket because it was the only thing I owned that nobody could repossess. I knew exactly what happened to boys like this in the system. I knew the cold sterility of the holding cells and the indifference of the caseworkers who were too overworked to care about one more lost child. "No," I said. The word came out sharper than the sleet. Julian paused, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Excuse me." "Put the phone away, Julian," I said, my voice gaining strength. "We are not calling the police." "Odessa, be rational," Julian snapped, stepping closer but careful not to get too near the boy. "You don't know him, he could be dangerous, he could be carrying anything." We have a liability insurance policy to think about. You run a business, not a shelter. It's a kitchen, Julian. We feed people, I shot back. We feed them and send them on their way, he argued, his patience thinning. We don't bring them home. This is messy. This is how you lose everything you've built. The boy began to stand, his legs shaking so violently I thought they would snap. He clutched the rusted box tighter, his amber eyes darting between me and Julian, calculating his escape route. He was ready to run back into the freezing night rather than face the authorities. He would die out there. Tonight. I made my choice. I turned my back on my husband. I ignored his protest, ignored the logic that had kept our finances in the black, and ignored the safety protocols I had written myself. I crouched down in the slush, ruining my pants, bringing myself to eye level with the boy. The smell of wet wool and unwashed skin hit me, but I didn't flinch. I made tomato basil soup tonight, I said softly, keeping my hands visible and open. And fresh sourdough bread. It's still warm. The boy stopped, shivering for a split second, the primal need for food warring with his fear. I'm not calling anyone, I promised, looking directly into those amber eyes. But I am going back inside where it's warm. You can come with me or you can stay here, but that soup is really good. I stood up and extended a hand. I didn't grab him, I waited. Julian scoffed behind me. Oh, Tessa, this is ridiculous. You are compromising our security. I didn't look at Julian. I kept my eyes on the boy. Slowly, agonizingly, one small, grime-stained hand released its grip on the rusted box just enough to reach out. His fingers brushed mine. They were like ice. I closed my hand around his, a firm, anchoring grip. I pulled him gently toward me and he stumbled forward, his resistance breaking under the weight of his exhaustion. He's not coming in the front, Julian warned, blocking the doorway. Move, Julian, I said. My voice was low, dangerous. I had never spoken to him like that in 5 years of marriage. Move, or I lock you out here with the rats. Julian stared at me, shocked by the venom in my tone. He stepped aside, his jaw tight. I pulled the boy across the threshold, out of the biting wind and into the golden warmth of my kitchen. As the door clicked shut, sealing out the storm, I looked down at the small figure dripping onto my clean floors. He looked up at me, still clutching that rusted box, and for the first time I saw the boy beneath the survival instinct. I didn't know it then, but I had just invited a hurricane into my life. But looking at his amber eyes, I knew I would do it 1,000 times over. I'm Odessa Thorne, 32 years old, and I risked my marriage and my reputation to give a silent, shivering boy a second chance at life. The silence was the loudest thing in the house. For the first 3 days, the boy didn't speak a single word. He didn't ask for food, he didn't ask for the bathroom, and he didn't ask why a stranger had pulled him out of a freezing alleyway and driven him to a suburban fortress. He just existed, occupying space with a terrifying stillness that made the air in my home feel heavy and charged. His name was Leo. I only knew this because I found it stitched crudely with red thread into the lining of the oversized, moth-eaten coat he refused to take off. I set up a military-style cot in the spare room downstairs. It used to be Julian's home office before he moved his operations to a glass tower downtown, and the walls were still painted a severe, sterile gray. I tried to soften it with a quilt I'd knitted myself, a splash of yellow wool against the gloom, but Leo didn't seem to notice. He sat on the edge of the canvas cot, his feet dangling inches from the hardwood, clutching that rusted metal box like it was an oxygen tank. Julian's disgust was a physical force. He walked around the house with his nose slightly wrinkled, as if the very presence of the boy had tainted the air filtration system. You're turning our home into a kennel, Julian hissed at me on the second night. We were in the master bedroom, the door firmly shut. He's feral, Odessa. You saw how he looked at me when I walked into the kitchen, like he wanted to slit my throat. He looked at you like he was terrified you were going to kick him, I whispered back, pulling my hair out of a ponytail. My scalp ached. He's a child, Julian, 10 years old, maybe 11. He's a liability, Julian countered, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, preparing for a late dinner with investors he claimed was unavoidable. If he steals something, if he hurts you, don't say I didn't warn. I'm sleeping in the guest suite until he's gone. I didn't beg him to stay. I felt a strange relief when he left. The real battle, however, wasn't with Julian, it was with Leo's instincts. On the third afternoon, I tried to help him out of the coat. The heating in our house was efficient, and beads of sweat were gathering on his forehead, cutting tracks through the grime on his face. I approached him slowly, telegraphing my movements the way you would with a wounded animal. It's warm in here, Leo, I said softly, reaching out. Let me take this heavy thing, I can wash it for you. My fingers barely grazed the wool of his shoulder. He flinched. It wasn't a small shy away, it was a violent, full-body spasm. He threw his arms up to cover his head, curling his torso inward to protect his vital organs. It was a muscle memory born of repeated, forceful trauma. He expected a blow. He expected pain. I froze, my hand hovering in the air, my heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. I pulled my hand back slowly, pressing it against my chest. I'm sorry, I breathed, tears pricking my eyes. I promise, Leo, I will never ever hit you. He lowered his arms slowly, his amber eyes wide and unblinking, searching my face for the lie. He didn't find one, but he didn't relax either. Just then the front door chimed. My sister, Beatrix, breathed in a cloud of expensive perfume and entitlement. She found me in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, shaking from the encounter with Leo. I heard the rumors, Beatrix said, not bothering with a hello. She placed her designer handbag on the island, far away from where Leo was sitting in the adjacent dining nook. Julian called me. He says you've lost your mind. Julian talks too much, I muttered, turning to the sink to hide my face. He says you brought a street rat into the house. Beatrix lowered her voice, but in the open plan layout it carried. Odessa, look around you. You have white sofas, you have crystal vases, you have a life people kill for. You can't just bringing that in here, it's reckless. He's a human being, Beatrix, I snapped, spinning around, not a stray dog. He's dangerous, she insisted, gesturing vaguely toward the dining nook. You don't know where he's been, you don't know what diseases he has. You're putting yourself at risk for what? A savior complex? I was about to scream at her to throw her out of my house when a small sound stopped me. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I looked past Beatrix's shoulder. Leo was sitting at the table. He hadn't touched the sandwich I made him. Instead, he had picked up a white plastic fork I'd left on the napkin. He wasn't playing with it. He was using one of the tines to meticulously, obsessively clean the dirt from underneath his fingernails. I watched, mesmerized. His hands were filthy, covered in the soot and grease of the city, but his movements were oddly precise. He scraped the grime away, wiped the tine on a paper towel, and repeated the process on the next finger. He did it with the concentration of a surgeon. He wasn't just a runaway. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. I realized then that he was trying to make himself acceptable. He was trying to scrub away the street because he was ashamed of it. Even in his silence, even in his fear, he had pride. He had been taught that cleanliness was next to godliness, and he was trying to find his way back to some semblance of order in a world that had been chaotic and cruel. Look at him, I whispered to Beatrix, my voice trembling with a new kind of resolve. Beatrix turned, her lip curled, but her expression faltered when she saw what he was doing. He's not a rat, I said, feeling the truth of it settle deep in my bones. He's a boy who knows he deserves to be clean, and I'm going to make sure he stays that way. I walked past my stunned sister and went to the linen closet. I pulled out the thickest, softest towel I owned and a bar of lavender soap. I was done being afraid of his fear. I was going to fight for him, even if I had to fight him to do it. He was staying, and Julian and Beatrix were just going to have to deal with the hurricane. I'm Odessa Thorne, 32 years old, and I just discovered that the silent, traumatized boy living in my guest room is a mathematical prodigy who understands my finances better than I do. The red ink on the page looked less like numbers and more like a crime scene. I sat at the granite island in the center of my kitchen, my head resting in my hands, the throbbing behind my eyes matching the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. My catering business, Thorn and Time, was supposed to be my independence, my one thing that didn't belong to Julian. Instead, it was a sinking ship. I had been staring at the ledger for 3 hours. The overhead costs were strangling me. The supplier for the truffles had hiked his prices again, the delivery van needed a new transmission, and I was bleeding cash faster than I could book events. You're going to have to shut it down, Odessa. Julian's voice echoed in my memory from breakfast that morning. He hadn't been cruel, just dismissive. It's a cute hobby, but you're not a businesswoman, you're a wife. Let me handle the finances, you just handle the flowers. The shame burned hot in my throat. I couldn't ask him for a bailout. I wouldn't. I pushed the ledger away, the heavy leather binding sliding across the marble with a defeated scrape. I needed coffee. I needed clarity. I'll be right back, I muttered to the empty room, though I knew I wasn't alone. Leo was there. He was always there now. It had been a week since I brought him in from the storm. He spent most of his time in the corner of the kitchen, sitting on a high stool, his legs hooked around the rungs. He still wore that oversized, moth-eaten coat, though I had managed to wash it while he slept. He watched me with those amber eyes, tracking my movements like a surveillance camera, but he never spoke. He never touched anything. I walked into the pantry to grab a fresh bag of espresso beans. It took me maybe 3 minutes. I had to climb the step ladder to reach the top shelf where I hid the good roast. When I stepped back into the kitchen, the sound stopped me dead. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. It was the sound of graphite tearing across paper. Fast, aggressive. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped the bag of beans on the counter and rushed toward the island. Leo was standing there. He had climbed off his stool. He was leaning over my ledger, my grandmother's antique silver mechanical pencil clutched in his small, scarred hand. "Leo," I gasped, panic flaring. "No, sweetie, don't." I thought he was scribbling. I thought he was destroying the only record of my accounts I had left. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch at my voice. His hand moved with a terrifying speed, a blur of motion that seemed unnatural for a child, unnatural for anyone. His eyes were locked on the columns of numbers, his pupils dilated, his breath coming in shallow, rhythmic bursts. I reached out to grab his wrist to stop the destruction, but then I looked down. I froze. My hand hovered inches from his arm. He wasn't scribbling, he was correcting. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat. In the margins of the ledger, in neat, angular script that looked nothing like a child's handwriting, he was rewriting my entire inventory strategy. He had crossed out the truffle supplier. Next to it, he had written a formula calculating the cost per ounce versus the spoilage rate, proving I was losing 20% of my stock before it even hit the plate. He drew a line to the delivery costs. He had circled the fuel surcharges and written a new route schedule in the white space, grouping deliveries by zip code to reduce mileage by a third. I watched, paralyzed, as he slashed through my labor projections. He wrote a single number at the bottom of the page, $4,200. That was the exact amount I was short for the month. He had found it. He had found the waste in under 3 minutes. He finished the calculation with a sharp dot of the pencil, then slowly set the tool down. The frantic energy left his body instantly, leaving him small and trembling again. He looked up at me. I was gripping the edge of the granite so hard my knuckles were white. "Leo," I whispered, my voice shaking. How did you do this?" I looked at the page again. It wasn't just math, it was logistical genius. It was the kind of restructuring Julian paid consultants thousands of dollars an hour to do for his firm. Leo looked at the numbers, then back at me. He shifted his weight, pulling the oversized coat tighter around his frame. Then it happened. The corner of his mouth twitched. Slowly, tentatively, a smile broke across his face. It wasn't a child's grin, it was a ghost of a smile, shy and proud and heartbreakingly beautiful. It was the first time I had seen anything other than terror in his expression. "Patterns," he said. His voice was raspy from disuse, deep for his age. "It's just patterns, like music." I stared at him, tears springing to my eyes. "You understand this? You understand the accounts?" He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I used to watch my father do the books before. I asked gently, sensing the precariousness of the moment. He traced a scar on the back of his hand with his thumb. "Before the bad men came, my father said numbers don't lie, only people lie." A chill ran down my spine, icy and sharp. The way he said it, the bad men, carried a weight that terrified me. This wasn't just a homeless runaway. This was a boy who had come from something, from someone who taught him high-level economics before his world was destroyed. I looked at the ledger, then at the boy. I realized then that I wasn't just harboring a refugee, I was harboring a genius. "You saved me, Leo," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I wasn't talking about the money. He looked up, his amber eyes burning with an intensity that made me want to hide him from the world forever. "The numbers were wrong," he whispered. "I fixed them for you." I reached out, and for the first time he didn't flinch. I placed my hand over his on the cool granite. "Yes," I said, "you fixed them." I didn't know who the bad men were. I didn't know who his father was. But looking at the terrifying intelligence in those eyes, I knew one thing for certain: Julian was wrong. Leo wasn't a liability. He was a king in exile, and I was going to help him reclaim his throne. I'm Odessa Thorne, 32 years old, and my husband just admitted to disposing of a child like he was last week's garbage. The air in the hallway was thick enough to choke on. It had been 3 days since Leo fixed my ledgers, 3 days of a fragile, terrifying peace that I knew couldn't last. Julian had been watching us, his eyes cold and predatory, tracking the way I made Leo oatmeal in the morning, the way I bought him new sneakers, the way I was slowly becoming a mother to a boy who wasn't mine. It finally snapped over something pathetic: a dropped glass. Leo had been helping me dry the dishes. He insisted on earning his keep, and a crystal tumbler slipped from his soapy fingers. It shattered against the tile with a sound like a gunshot. Julian was in the kitchen before the echoes died away. "That's it," he roared, his face twisting into a mask of ugly red rage. "I am done living in a halfway house for delinquents." I stepped in front of Leo instantly, shielding his trembling body with my own. "It was an accident, Julian. It's just a glass." "It's not about the glass, Odessa. It's about the filth you've dragged into our lives." He slammed his hand on the counter, making the remaining dishes jump. He stares at me. He creeps around like a rat. I want him gone, tonight. My heart hammered against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, clarifying fury. He is a child. He has nowhere to go. I don't care, Julian screamed, the sound vibrating in the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house I thought was a home. You have a choice, Odessa, right now. You can have this marriage, this house, the life I provide for you, or you can have the stray. Choose. I didn't blink, I didn't hesitate. I felt the warmth of Leo's small hand clutching the back of my shirt, and the answer was as natural as breathing. Then I choose him, I said, my voice deadly quiet. If you want him to leave, you'll have to drag me out with him. Julian stared at me, his chest heaving. The red drained from his face, replaced by a chilling, blank expression. He straightened his tie, smoothing the silk with a slow, deliberate motion. Fine, he said, have it your way. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. I heard the front door close a moment later. I thought I had won. I thought the silence that followed was victory. I turned to Leo, crouching down to brush a shard of glass away from his sneaker. It's okay, I whispered, though my hands were shaking. You're safe here. But we needed food. The pantry was bare, and with the extra mouth to feed, I had to do the weekend sourcing run for Thorn and Time. I couldn't take Leo. The wholesale market was a chaotic crush of people and noise that I knew would trigger his anxiety. Lock the door behind me, I told him, handing him the spare key. Do not open it for anyone but me. I'll be back in 40 minutes. He nodded, his amber eyes wide and trusting. That look would haunt me for the rest of my life. I drove like a maniac. I tore through the aisles of the market, throwing sacks of flour and crates of vegetables into my cart, ignoring the prices, ignoring the quality checks I usually obsess over. A sick feeling curled in my stomach, a primal instinct screaming that I had made a mistake. I made it back in 35 minutes. When I pulled into the driveway, Julian's car was back. It was parked crookedly, the engine ticking as it cooled. Panic seized me. I didn't bother with the groceries. I left the trunk open and sprinted to the front door. It was unlocked. Leo, I called out, bursting into the foyer. Silence. The house was deafeningly silent. Leo, I screamed, running toward the guest room. The door was open. The bed was stripped. The neatly folded pile of clothes I had bought him, the jeans, the soft hoodie, the socks, was gone. The room looked sterile. It looked as if he had never existed. I spun around, my breath coming in short, painful gasps, and that's when I saw it. On the floor near the foot of the bed lay a small, tarnished silver locket. I fell to my knees and snatched it up. It was heavy, old metal, warm from being held. I had never seen Leo wear it. He must have kept it hidden in his pocket, his one secret treasure. I pried it open with a trembling fingernail. Inside, there was no photo. There was only an engraving on the left side. It was a crest, a roaring lion entangled in vines, sitting above a shield with a diagonal crack. It looked ancient. It looked regal. It was a crest I didn't recognize, but it radiated a power that made the hair on my arms stand up. He forgot that, a voice said from the doorway. I whipped around. Julian was leaning against the doorframe, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He looked relaxed. He looked satisfied. Where is he? I snarled, clutching the locket so hard the metal bit into my palm. Julian shrugged, taking a sip. I took him for a drive. Dropped him off at the transit station on the edge of the city. Gave him $50. That's more than his mother probably ever gave him. The world tilted on its axis. The transit station. The one known for trafficking, for drugs, for the kind of darkness a boy like Leo wouldn't survive a single night in. You left him, my voice broke. He's 10 years old, Julian. You left him alone. He's a survivor, isn't he? He'll figure it out. Julian pushed off the doorframe, walking toward me with a smirk. Now, can we please get back to, I didn't plan. I moved with the force of a tidal wave. I stood up and shoved Julian so hard he stumbled backward, his expensive scotch splashing over his silk shirt. "Get out," I screamed, the sound tearing from the bottom of my lungs. "Excuse me," he looked at me stunned. "Get out of my house." I grabbed his arm, digging my nails in, and dragged him toward the front door. I possessed a strength I didn't know I had, a hysterical mother bear strength fueled by pure hatred. "You are a monster. You are done. We are done." "Odessa, stop being dramatic." I shoved him through the open front door. He stumbled onto the porch, almost tripping over the welcome mat. "If I see you again," I hissed, tears streaming down my face, "I will kill you." I slammed the door in his face and threw the deadbolt. I didn't wait for him to leave. I grabbed my keys and the locket and I ran back to my car. I drove to the transit station, screaming his name out the window, checking every bench, every alley, every shadow. But the station was empty. The bus to the coast had left 10 minutes ago. I stood on the cracked pavement, clutching the silver locket with the lion crest to my chest, and screamed until my throat bled. He was gone. My boy, my genius, my quiet king was gone, and the only thing I had left was a promise to the night sky that I would never stop looking for him. I'm Odessa Thorne, 35 years old, and I have bankrupted my award-winning restaurant chasing a ghost. The rain battered against the window of the detective's office, matching the relentless drumming in my skull. I stared at the man across the desk. Mr. Vance looked tired. His cheap suit smelled like stale tobacco and defeat. "I can't take your money anymore, Mrs. Thorne," he said, pushing the check back across the scratched laminate surface. My hand shot out, pinning the check down. "I didn't ask you to save me money, I asked you to find him." "There is nothing to find," Vance sighed, rubbing his temples. "We've combed every shelter within 500 miles. We've checked the foster systems in 3 states. We've run facial recognition against every Jane and John Doe in the morgues." I flinched. The word morgue felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I focused on breathing, forcing air into lungs that felt too tight for my chest. "He isn't dead," I whispered. "I would know." Vance leaned forward, his expression softening into a pity that made me want to scream. "Odessa, look at the facts. It's been 3 years. The boy had no paper trail, no birth certificate, no social security number. It's like he fell out of the sky." "What about the crest?" I asked, my fingers unconsciously drifting to the neckline of my blouse. Under the silk, the silver locket sat heavy and cold against my skin. "The lion and the vines." Vance hesitated. He looked at the file on his desk, then back at me. A shadow passed over his eyes. "I found a match for the heraldry," he said slowly. "But it doesn't make sense." "Tell me." "It's an old crest, pre-war. It belongs to a royal house in Valoria, a small nation on the eastern border of Europe. But that house was dissolved years ago during their civil conflict. There was a kidnapping, a high-profile case involving the youngest heir." He paused, lowering his voice. "Everyone involved in that search ended up disappearing, Mrs. Thorne. If this boy is connected to that, you aren't looking for a runaway, you're looking for a political target." A chill swept through the room that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The bad men, that's what Leo had said. "So we go to Valoria," I said, my voice trembling but determined. "No," Vance said, standing up. "You go home. I'm closing the file for your safety and frankly for mine." He left the check on the table. I walked out into the rain. I felt hollowed out. I had spent every penny of my savings. I had sold the jewelry Julian had given me. I had taken out a second mortgage on the house. And now I had nothing but a terrifying whisper of a foreign country and a dead end. I drove to Thorn in time. It was supposed to be the dinner rush, but the parking lot was half empty. I walked into the kitchen and the smell hit me wrong. It smelled like burnt garlic and apathy. Chef, my sous chef Marco called out. He looked exhausted. The supplier put us on hold again, no credit. I stared at him. 3 years ago, I would have been on the phone screaming, fixing it, moving mountains. Now I just felt tired. I tied on my apron, but my hands were shaking. I tried to focus on the prep station. I picked up a knife to dice shallots, but my mind drifted. I saw amber eyes. I saw a small hand fixing my ledger. I saw the empty bed in the guest room. Crunch, the knife slipped. I looked down to see blood welling on my thumb, bright red against the white cutting board. Odessa, Marco rushed over, grabbing a towel. I stared at the blood. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the failure. I can't do this, I whispered. Let me wrap it up, Marco said gently. No, I pulled away, my voice rising. I mean, I can't do this, any of it. I ripped the apron off. I stormed out of the kitchen, ignoring the shocked faces of my staff. I went into my office and slammed the door. The stacks of unpaid bills were teetering towers on my desk. My phone buzzed. It was Clara, my best friend. Come out tonight, the text read. It's been 3 years. Oh, you have to stop. He was just a stray kid. You did what you could. I threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a satisfying crack. Just a stray kid. They didn't understand. They didn't see the intelligence in his eyes. They didn't feel the way he gripped my shirt when he was scared. They didn't know that for 3 days I had a son, and for 3 years I had been mourning him. I sat on the floor of my office, surrounded by the ruin of my ambition. The restaurant was failing. My savings were gone. My marriage was ashes. I reached under my shirt and pulled out the locket. I pried it open with my uninjured hand. The lion roared silently back at me. I failed you, I sobbed into the empty room. I let him take you. But as I traced the crack in the shield with my thumb, the memory of the pie's words surfaced through the grief. Valoria. Julian hadn't just dropped him at a transit station. That was a lie. If Leah was connected to a royal house and Julian knew, my tears stopped. The sorrow in my chest hardened into something cold and jagged. I wasn't done. I was broke, I was bleeding, and I was alone. But I knew the name of the country now. I stood up. I wiped the blood from my thumb onto my jeans. I wasn't going to move on. I was going to find a map. If I had to burn the rest of my life to the ground to find the road to Valoria, I would light the match myself. I'm Odessa Thorne, 42 years old, and I am watching the sun set on the wreckage of my entire life. The bank officer, a man with kind eyes and a clipboard that served as his shield, left an hour ago. He told me I had until midnight to vacate the premises. He was polite. He was professional. He spoke to me like I was a tragic accident he didn't want to witness. I hated him for his pity. Now silence is the only tenant left in this house. I sit on the hardwood floor of the dining room. The furniture is gone. I sold the mahogany table 3 months ago to pay for a private investigator in Zurich who claimed he had a lead on the Valorian crest. It was a scam. They were always scams. The chairs went next, sold to a pawn shop to keep the electricity on for 1 more month. The room echoes with the ghost of who I used to be. I catch my reflection in the sliding glass door leading to the overgrown garden. I barely recognize the woman staring back. My hair, once a rich, glossy chestnut, is streaked with coarse gray at the temples. I stopped dyeing it years ago. Vanity requires energy, and I spent every ounce of mine chasing a ghost. My face is gaunt, the lines around my mouth etched deep by 12 years of frowning at maps and weeping over dead ends. 12 years. It feels like a century. It feels like 5 minutes. The world kept spinning while I stood frozen in that parking lot at the transit station. The seasons changed. Presidents were elected. Trends died. But I remained stuck in the moment I realized I had failed him. I look at the front door. The closed sign from Thorn and Time hangs crookedly on the interior handle. I took it with me when the restaurant finally went under 6 years ago. I couldn't save the business. I couldn't focus on risotto and profit margins when my mind was constantly screaming his name. My sous chef Marco tried to hold it together, but a ship cannot sail without a captain. I let it sink. I let everything sink. My phone buzzes on the floor beside me. The screen lights up the gloom. Julian, I don't need to unlock it to know what it says. He has a radar for my misery. He smells it like a shark smells blood in the water. I pick it up, my thumb hovering over the screen. Subject, the house. Body, heard the foreclosure went through today. Tragic, Odessa. Really? You had a beautiful life. You had a husband who adored you. You threw it all away for a failed charity project that didn't even want to be saved. Hope the moral superiority keeps you warm tonight. Give it up. I feel a dull throb of hatred, but it's weak. I'm too tired to hate him properly anymore. Julian 1, that's the bitter pill I have to swallow every morning. He remarried 5 years ago. A 26-year-old model with a laugh like wind chimes. They have a daughter now. He plays the doting father on social media, erasing the stain of what he did to Lee with filtered photos of family vacations in the Hamptons. He moved on. The world moved on. I look down at my lap. My hands are clutching the only thing I couldn't sell. It's a rusted metal box. I found it under the bed in the guest room, Leo's room, a week after he vanished. It's heavy, made of iron that smells like old blood and earth. There is no keyhole. There are no hinges. It looks like a solid brick of metal, but if I shake it, I can feel something shifting inside. For 12 years, this box has been my paperweight, my anchor. I trace the rough, pitted surface of the iron. I have taken it to locksmiths. I have taken it to metalworkers. I even took it to a geologist. No one could open it without destroying what was inside. They all said it was welded shut, sealed with a heat that shouldn't have been possible for a 10-year-old boy to generate. What did you leave me, Leo? I whisper. My voice cracks in the empty room. It sounds pathetic. I lift the silver locket that still hangs around my neck. The lion crest is worn smooth from my thumb rubbing it 1,000 times a day. The locket and the box, two puzzle pieces that I never figured out how to fit together. The shadows in the corners of the room are stretching out, reaching for me. The electricity was cut this morning. Soon, it will be pitch black. I feel the tears coming, but they aren't the hysterical, hot tears of the early years. These are cold. They are the tears of a woman who knows she has reached the end of the road. I am 42. I am homeless. I am divorced. I am bankrupt. I remember the way Leo looked at me the first night I fed him, the intelligence in those amber eyes, the way he fixed my ledger. He was a king in rags, and I was the fool who let him slip through my fingers. I tried, I say to the silence. I promise you I tried. I pull my knees to my chest, curling around the rusted box like it's a living thing. The cold from the floor seeps into my bones. This is it. This is how the story ends. Not with a bang, not with a reunion, but with a middle-aged woman sitting in the dark, waiting for the bank to come and change the locks. I close my eyes and lean my head back against the wall. I just want to sleep. I want to sleep and dream of a timeline where I didn't shove Julian out the door, but instead grabbed Leo's hand and ran. Knock, knock, knock. The sound is sharp, authoritative. It cuts through the silence like a gunshot. My eyes snap open. It's probably the sheriff. They send them to escort trespassers off the property if they linger too long after the deadline. I'm going, I call out, my voice raspy. I start to scramble to my feet, clutching the box. I'm leaving now. You don't need to come in. No. Knock, knock. It's rhythmic, heavy, not the polite rap of a bank agent nor the aggressive pounding of police. It sounds ceremonial. I freeze. A strange sensation washes over me. The hair on my arm stands up, prickling with static electricity. The air in the room suddenly feels dense, charged with a pressure that makes my ears pop. I look at the rusted box in my hands. It's vibrating. For 12 years, it has been a dead lump of iron. Now it is humming. A low, resonant thrum that travels from my palms straight to my heart. The knocking stops. Odessa Thorne, a voice calls from the other side of the door. I stop breathing. It isn't Julian. It isn't the sheriff. The voice is deep, baritone, and terrifyingly smooth. It sounds like velvet wrapped around a dagger. But under the depth, under the manhood and the power, there is a cadence I would recognize in hell. Open the door, Odessa. The box in my hands gives a violent jerk, and with a sound like a cracking bone, the rusted lid pops open. I stared down at the open box, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Inside the iron shell, resting on a bed of velvet that had somehow survived a decade of rot, sat a ring. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a heavy band of gold set with a ruby dark as coagulated blood, etched with the same roaring lion that hung around my neck. The vibration in the metal died instantly, leaving only the cold weight of the truth in my palms. "Oh, Tessa." The voice came again from the other side of the door, louder this time, stripping away the years, the silence, and the grief. I scrambled to my feet, the box clutched to my chest like a shield. My legs felt like water. I stumbled toward the hallway, drawn by a magnetic pull that terrified me more than the foreclosure. The floorboards beneath my bare feet began to tremble. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the foundation of the house. I reached the kitchen window, my breath fogging the glass, and pushed aside the dirty curtain. My breath hitched in my throat. The street, usually empty save for the occasional delivery truck, was transformed. A motorcade of 6 black SUVs idled at the curb, their engines producing the low roar that shook my kitchen. They had tinted windows and diplomatic flags, crimson and gold, snapping on the hoods. Men in sharp suits and earpieces spilled out of the vehicles, moving with the precision of a wolf pack. They fanned out, forming a perimeter around my humble, rotting entrance. They looked at my overgrown grass and peeling paint with professional indifference, hands hovering near their waistbands. This wasn't a visit. This was an invasion. The lead car's rear door opened. A pair of polished black leather boots hit the cracked pavement. I watched, frozen, as a man unfolded himself from the back seat. He was tall, impossibly tall, broad-shouldered and commanding. He wore a charcoal suit that was tailored to within an inch of its life, the fabric shimmering under the fading streetlights. It cost more than my entire building. It cost more than my entire existence. He turned toward the house. My knees gave out. I gripped the windowsill to keep from sliding to the floor. It was the jawline. Sharper now, carved from granite rather than boyish softness, but I knew the angle. I knew the way he held his head, high and defiant, as if challenging the sky to strike him down. He looked up at the house. His gaze swept over the dark windows, the sagging gutters, and finally landed on the front door where the crooked, closed sign for my restaurant still hung. He frowned. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the corners of his mouth, but I felt it like a physical blow. He stepped onto the walkway. The men in suits parted for him like the Red Sea. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think, I just moved. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the deadbolt. My fingers were shaking so badly I scraped my knuckles against the metal. I threw the lock back. I ripped the door open. The evening air rushed in, cool and smelling of exhaust and ozone. He stood on the bottom step of my porch. Up close, the transformation was violent. The scrawny, terrified boy who had stolen bread from my dumpster was gone. In his place stood a titan. His hair was darker, cut short and severe. A thin white scar sliced through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a life I knew nothing about. But the eyes, those amber eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence that had haunted my dreams for 12 years. They locked onto mine, and the world narrowed down to just the two of us. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He looked at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle, his gaze dropping to the rusted box I was still clutching to my chest, then back to my face. "You kept it," he said. His voice was the one I had heard through the wood, velvet, and steel. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I was a 42-year-old woman wearing stained jeans and a t-shirt, standing before a god of wealth and power. Tears blurred my vision, hot and stinging. "Leo," I whispered, the name feeling foreign and familiar all at once. He took a step up. The porch creaked under his weight. He was close enough now that I could smell him: sandalwood, rain, and something metallic. "That was the name you gave me," he said softly, "but it is not who I am." He reached out. His hand, large and scarred, hovered near my face. I didn't flinch. I leaned into it. His thumb brushed away a tear tracking through the grime on my cheek. "I told you I would pay you back, Odessa," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "I told you I would fix the ledger." You're alive," I choked out, a sob breaking free from my chest. "I thought I killed you. I thought I let you die." His expression darkened, the amber fire in his eyes flared. "You saved me," he corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And now I am returning the favor." He glanced over his shoulder at the bank officer's foreclosure notice stapled to the siding of the house. He reached out and ripped it down with a single violent motion, crumpling the paper in his fist. "Pack a bag," he commanded, turning back to me. "What?" I blinked, my brain struggling to catch up to the reality shifting beneath my feet. "Pack a bag," he repeated. "Everything else stays: the furniture, the memories, the debt. Leave it all." "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, invading my personal space until I had to tilt my head back to look him in the eye. He radiated heat, a furnace of resolve that melted the cold that had lived in my bones for a decade. "Home," he said. "To Valoria." He looked down at the ring in the box, then at the locket around my neck. "You aren't homeless anymore, Odessa," he said, and for the first time a ghost of a smile touched his lips, the same crooked, boyish smile I remembered. "You're with me." Behind him, the engines of the SUVs revved in unison, a chorus of power waiting for his signal. "And I don't let anyone take what is mine." I looked at the motorcade, then back at the man who used to be a stray kid sleeping on my pantry floor. My life as Odessa Thorne, the failed restaurateur, ended in that heartbeat. "Okay," I breathed. "Okay," he echoed. He offered me his hand. I took it. "I'm Odessa Thorne, 42, and the starving boy I once fed leftovers to just returned as a monarch to burn my debts to ash." His fingers closed around mine, swallowing my hand in a grip that was warm, rough, and terrifyingly solid. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight up my arm, seizing my heart in a rhythm that felt too fast, too young for a woman who had given up on hope years ago. "Come," he said, gently pulling me across the threshold. "We don't have much time. My enemies are patient, but they are not idle." We stepped back into the house. The transition from the cool night air to the stagnant, dusty warmth of my failing restaurant felt jarring. Just moments ago, this place had been my tomb. Now, with him standing in the center of the room, it felt like a staging ground for a war I didn't understand. He walked through the space with a predator's grace, his presence filling the room with an authority that made it hard to breathe. The floorboards, which usually creaked under the slightest weight, seemed to silence themselves beneath his boots. I stood by the counter, trembling, clutching the open iron box to my chest. My mind was a kaleidoscope of shattered logic. The SUVs outside, the suit, the scar. He stopped 5 feet away and turned to face me. The ambient light from the street lamp outside cast half his face in shadow, highlighting the sharp angle of a jaw that had once been soft with malnutrition. He reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit. I flinched. The movement was instinctive, born of a decade of dodging bill collectors and angry landlords. He paused, his eyes softening just a fraction. He pulled out a small object and held it up. It was a key. It was ancient iron and rusted in a pattern that mirrored the box in my arms. I kept the key, he said, his voice low and vibrating against the peeling wallpaper. You kept the lock. I looked down at the box, then back at him. Leo, I don't understand. The ring, the cars, who are you really? He took a slow breath, his chest expanding against the fine fabric of his shirt. He removed a pair of dark sunglasses from his other pocket. He must have been wearing them before he stepped out of the car and set them on my greasy counter. Leah was a name of convenience, Odessa, a ghost I wore to survive. He stepped closer. The amber eyes were unmistakable, but the steel behind them was new. It was the look of a man who had walked through fire and decided he liked the heat. My name, he said, pronouncing each syllable with the weight of a gavel strike, is King Leonidas of Ethelgard. The air left my lungs. Ethelgard, it sounded like a fairy tale or a nightmare. A small, sovereign state in the mountains of Europe known for its isolation and its blood-soaked history. A king, I whispered. You were eating bread out of a dumpster, Leo. You were shivering in my pantry. I was in exile, he corrected, his jaw tightening. My father was murdered in a coup when I was 12. His generals, they slaughtered everyone, my mother, my sisters. He looked away, his gaze fixing on a water stain on the ceiling, but I knew he was seeing something else, something horrific. I ran, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it infinitely worse. I ran until I hit the ocean, then I ran until I hit this town, and then I found you. He looked back at me. The intensity of his stare pinned me to the floor. You gave me a blanket when I deserved nothing. You fed me when you barely had enough for yourself. You didn't ask for my name or my title or my blood. He took the key and stepped forward, gently taking the box from my paralyzed hands. He fit the key into the hidden mechanism inside the lid, a slot I hadn't even noticed next to the velvet bed where the ring sat. Click. It turned perfectly. I spent 10 years reclaiming a throne stolen by my father's murderers, he said. 10 years of alliances, of bloodshed, of sleeping in mud and negotiating with devils. I took it all back, every inch of land, every stone of the castle. He closed the box and pressed it back into my hands. But a kingdom is cold comfort without a home, Odessa. My knees were shaking so hard I had to lean against the counter. This was insanity. This was a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. Why come back? I asked, my voice cracking. You have a country, you have wealth. Why come back to a foreclosure in a dead-end town for a woman who failed at everything she ever tried? He closed the distance between us in a single stride. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs brushing over my cheekbones. His skin was rough, calloused from sword or gun or both. Because you are the only person in the world who loved me when I was nothing, he said fiercely. And I swore on my father's grave that when I wore the crown, you would wear one too. He leaned his forehead against mine. I could feel the heat radiating off him, a furnace of resolve. Now pack your bag, Odessa. The plane is waiting, and I will not leave this town without you. I looked into his eyes, the eyes of a king, the eyes of a boy, the eyes of the only man who had ever looked at me and seen something worth saving. I turned and ran toward the stairs. I didn't know where Ethelgard was. I didn't know how to be a queen. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't letting him go again. I'm Odessa Thorne, 42, and the homeless boy I sheltered just destroyed my enemies without lifting a weapon. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely zip the duffel bag I'd dragged out from under my bed. I threw in 2 pairs of jeans, a handful of t-shirts, and the photograph of my parents that sat on the nightstand, the only witnesses to the slow, agonizing death of this building. When I hurried back down the stairs, the air in the diner had changed. It was no longer just me and the ghost of the boy I used to know. The room was swarming with silent, broad-shouldered men in dark suits who moved with terrifying efficiency. Leo stood in the center of them, a calm eye in a hurricane of power. As my boots hit the bottom step, he looked up, and for a split second, the king of Ethelgard vanished, replaced by the boy who used to look at me to check if it was okay to eat. He extended a hand toward me, and I went to him like a moth pulled into a flame, disregarding the armed guards watching my every move. "Is it done?" he asked, not to me but to the air over my shoulder. A man with silver hair and a briefcase materialized from the shadows near the entrance. He didn't look like a soldier, he looked like a shark in Italian silk. "It is, Your Majesty," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and cold. Leo snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp, like a pistol crack in the quiet room. The lawyer stepped forward and thrust a thick stack of documents into my free hand. I looked down, my eyes struggling to focus on the dense legal jargon, but one line stood out in bold, black ink: deed of transfer. And below that, a map outlining not just my restaurant, but the bakery next door, the laundromat across the street, and the bank branch on the corner. What is this? I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The block," Leo said simply, his voice vibrating through his chest as he stepped closer to me. "I bought it, all of it." You bought the bank," I choked out, staring at him in bewilderment. "I bought the debt," he corrected, his amber eyes hardening into shards of flint. "And then I dissolved the entity holding it." He nodded to the lawyer, who flipped a page on a tablet he was holding. "Julian Vance," the lawyer recited, naming the bank officer who had sneered at me just yesterday while taping the eviction notice to my door. "Currently in custody. Our legal team uncovered a decade of embezzlement and predatory lending schemes within his branch. The police are escorting him to a holding cell as we speak." My mouth fell open. Julian, the man who had made it his personal mission to humiliate me, who had laughed when I begged for an extension, was gone. Erased. "He won't bother you again," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "No one will." I looked from the deed in my hand to the face of the man who had orchestrated this devastation in the span of an hour. It wasn't just charity, it was a surgical dismantling of everything that had hurt me. I felt a sob rise in my throat, hot and sharp. "Leo," I whispered, dropping the papers onto the nearest table. "You didn't have to do this. The money, it's too much." He reached out and took my hands in his. His skin was warm, familiar, rough with calluses that hadn't been there 10 years ago. He wasn't wearing gloves, and the contact grounded me, pulling me out of the panic and back into the reality of his presence. "Do you know what I remembered when I was lying in the mud in the darker parts of Europe?" he asked softly, ignoring the entourage watching us. "When I was cold and bleeding, and sure I wouldn't see the sunrise." I shook my head, tears spilling over my lashes. "I remembered the smell of rosemary and garlic," he said, his thumbs brushing over my knuckles. I remembered the yellow light of your kitchen. I remembered that someone somewhere had wanted me to live. He squeezed my hands, his grip tight, possessive. That memory kept me sane, Odessa. It was the only thing that did. He pulled me closer, until there was no space left between us, until I could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against my own. I am not here to give you a donation, he murmured, his breath brushing my forehead. I am not here to pay a bill and leave. He looked deep into my eyes, and I saw the raw, terrifying intensity of a man who had conquered a kingdom just to find his way back to the only door that had ever opened for him. I'm here to take you home. I'm Odessa Thorne, 42, and as I stepped out of the only home I had left, the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. The bell above the diner door jingled one last time, a hollow, tinny sound that had haunted my dreams for years. But today, it sounded like a funeral toll for my old life. I gripped the strap of my duffel bag so hard my knuckles turned white. My other hand was encased in Leo's warm, steady grip, pulling me from the shadows of the grease-stained entryway into the blinding afternoon sun. I expected a taxi, maybe a town car. I did not expect an invasion. My quiet, potholed street was choked with a line of black, armored SUVs that stretched as far as the eye could see. Men with earpieces and assault rifles slung discreetly under tailored jackets stood at attention, forming a human corridor that led straight to the open door of a massive vehicle that looked more like a tank than a car. The silence was deafening. Usually at this time of day, Mrs. Higgins would be yelling at her cats, or the kids from the high school would be revving their engines at the stop sign. But today the neighborhood was frozen. People were standing on their porches, their mouths hanging open. I saw the landlord's nephew, the one who had gleefully told me to get out by Friday, standing by the curb with a look of absolute terror on his face. I tried to shrink into myself. I was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days. My hair was a mess, and I carried the scent of stale frying oil. I didn't belong next to this man who looked like he had been carved out of marble and dressed by the gods. Leo, I hissed, trying to pull my hand back. Everyone is watching. I look like a mess. Leo stopped abruptly. The entire motorcade seemed to hold its breath. He didn't whisper. He didn't pull me into the car to hide me. Instead, he turned, his movements deliberate and regal, and faced the gawking crowd of neighbors who had watched me drown in debt for 5 years without offering a single lifeline. Let them watch, Leo said, his voice booming across the pavement. He released my hand only to wrap his arm around my waist, pulling me flush against his side. It was a claim. It was a brand. This woman, he announced, his amber eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of my tormentors, is the only reason I draw breath. When you looked at a starving child and saw vermin, she saw a human being. When you closed your doors, she opened hers. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had never wanted attention. I had only wanted to survive. I am King Leonidas of Ethelgard, he continued, the title landing with the weight of an anvil. And Odessa Thorne is the royal matriarch of my house. Anyone who speaks her name without reverence answers to me. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw Mrs. Higgins cross herself. I saw the landlord's nephew take a stumbling step backward, looking as if he might vomit. Leo looked down at me, and the hardness in his face melted into something agonizingly tender. He didn't care about the politics or the power display. He only cared that I understood. He wasn't dragging a subject back to his kingdom. He was bringing his savior home. Are you ready, Odessa? He asked softly. I looked at the diner one last time. I looked at the closed sign flipping in the wind. I looked at the cracked pavement where I had smoked cigarettes at 2:00 a.m., wondering how I would pay the electric bill. "I'm ready," I whispered. He guided me into the backseat of the SUV. The door closed with a heavy, pressurized thud, sealing out the noise, the dust, and the fear. The interior smelled of rich leather and sandalwood, the scent of him. As the convoy began to move, rolling smoothly over the broken streets of the town that had broken me, I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I quickly wiped it away, but Leo caught my wrist. He leaned over, his face inches from mine, his eyes searching my soul. "Don't mourn this place," he murmured, his thumb tracing the pulse at my wrist. "My palace has 1,000 rooms, Odessa, but the gardens, they have been gray and overgrown since the day my mother died." He kissed the inside of my palm. "They need a woman with your heart to make them bloom again." I leaned back against the seat, watching the town fade into a blur through the tinted glass. The knot of anxiety in my chest began to loosen, replaced by a strange, fierce warmth. I wasn't just the failing cook anymore. I wasn't just the woman who lost everything. I was the woman who had saved a king, and now he was saving me.